Carl Harper was the kind of man people barely remembered, yet his name would soon be whispered in terror because while neighbors saw only a quiet loner in a crumbling farmhouse, they had no idea he was hiding a chamber of horrors just beneath their feet. The farmhouse at the end of Miller's Road had always been there, tucked between thick trees and long stretches of farmland. It wasn't the kind of place that drew attention. The paint was faded, the windows looked dusty, and the front porch sagged under its own weight. Neighbors drove past it every day without thinking much about the man who lived inside. His name was Carl Harper, a solitary figure who rarely went into town. If he did, it was only for supplies, and even then, he kept to himself. He was the type of person people remembered only in fragments: a nod at the gas station, the back of his head at the grocery store, a figure seen in passing but never really known. The town, small and quiet, was the kind of place where unusual things were noticed quickly. That was why people grew uneasy when the delivery driver went missing. His truck was found idling at the edge of a dirt road. Doors shut, packages still stacked neatly in the back. The keys dangled from the ignition, and the engine hummed until it ran out of gas. At first, it seemed like an accident, maybe a sudden illness, maybe he wandered off for help. But days passed, and no one saw him again. Then came the boy, 16 years old, riding his bike down the familiar paths near the woods. He was supposed to be home for dinner. The bike was later discovered lying on its side, the wheels still spinning when a neighbor first spotted it. No sign of a struggle, no footprints, nothing to explain why the boy had vanished so suddenly. These disappearances weren't the kind of thing the town was used to. People left for college, for jobs, sometimes for good, but they didn't simply vanish. Parents started keeping their children indoors. Locks were checked twice. Porch lights burned all night. Fear crept in, quiet but heavy, clinging to every conversation at the diner and every whispered phone call between neighbors. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some blamed drifters passing through. Others talked about wild animals in the woods. But eventually, whispers began to circle back to the farmhouse. Not because anyone had seen Carl do anything suspicious, but because his presence was strange in its silence. He never joined the search parties. He never asked questions about what had happened. He just stayed where he always stayed, on his land, in his house, alone. People noticed odd things. Once they started looking closer, a faint glow in the distance late at night, as if lights were burning in the back of his property when most of the town was asleep. The sound of metal clanging, though it was too far to know what he was building. And sometimes the faint smell of smoke drifting across the fields without explanation. Despite all of this, no one wanted to confront Carl. He was quiet, polite enough if spoken to, and gave no real reason to accuse him of anything. Still, there was a feeling, the kind of instinct that lives deep in the bones. Something about him didn't sit right. As the days stretched into weeks and the missing people never returned, the farmhouse at the end of Miller's Road became more than just an old building in the background. It became a shadow in everyone's mind, a place that seemed to breathe with secrets the town wasn't ready to face. The police began their investigation with the kind of careful precision that small towns rarely see. Search parties combed through the woods, weaving between tall pines and brittle underbrush, shouting names into the silence. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to pieces of clothing, but they came back with nothing more than confusion, pacing in circles before giving up the trail entirely. Every lead dissolved into dead ends. The dirt road where the delivery truck was found was inspected inch by inch, but no footprints led away from it, and the gravel showed no signs of struggle. It was as if the driver had simply evaporated into the air. The teenager's abandoned bike only deepened the mystery. The chain was still greased, the tires full of air, the brakes intact. It looked ready to be ridden away at any moment, yet the boy who had been on it was gone. Detectives traced the boy's regular route, questioned his friends, and even searched his home computer for signs he might have planned to run away. Nothing matched. He had vanished in broad daylight without leaving a single clue behind. As suspicion spread, the police turned their attention to the farmhouse at the edge of town. Carl Harper's land bordered both discovery sites, and though he had no known criminal history, the coincidence was too heavy to ignore. Officers visited him more than once, their patrol cars crunching along his long driveway, headlights catching on the warped boards of the barn. Carl allowed them inside without hesitation. The shed was filled with the kind of clutter one might expect from years of solitary living: rusted tools, broken furniture, cracked jars, and stacks of old lumber. The barn smelled of oil and dust, with shafts of light falling through gaps in the roof. To the officers, it looked unremarkable, just another neglected space on a rural property. What they didn't know was that a few feet below them lay the true heart of Carl's property. Beneath a cleverly concealed trapdoor in the shed's floor sat a narrow passage leading to an underground chamber Carl had spent years constructing. Reinforced walls lined with shelves, a generator humming quietly, and another set of tools that looked far too clean compared to the rusted ones above. This was where Carl worked, where he kept his secrets safe from curious eyes. The shed above ground was a mask, a distraction carefully staged so that nothing appeared out of place. The police, believing they had done their job thoroughly, moved on to other leads. They checked abandoned houses, questioned out-of-town workers, and set up roadblocks at the highways. But the disappearances continued to haunt them, every new day widening the gulf between what they knew and what they couldn't explain. The farmhouse remained in the back of their minds, unsettling but unprovable, and Carl remained untouched, standing quietly on his porch whenever the patrol cars drove past, his face calm, his secrets intact beneath the very floor they had walked upon. Beneath the farmhouse, hidden under layers of soil and silence, Carl Harper's other life was written down in a notebook no one was meant to see. The black leather cover was worn, its corners bent and its pages thick with years of careful handwriting. Inside, each line carried a name, a date, and a few unsettling notes that gave insight into a mind driven not by impulse but by patience and design. It wasn't just a list, it was an archive of control, a record of disappearances that had shaken the town above without anyone knowing how deep the truth went. The notebook was kept on a metal shelf in the underground chamber, positioned neatly among tools, jars, and objects belonging to people who would never be seen again. A watch with a cracked strap, a pair of sneakers with frayed laces, a wallet stuffed with expired cards, ordinary items that became chilling when stripped of their owners. Each entry in the ledger was paired with these trophies, as if the physical object and the written word combined to anchor the memory in place. Carl had built himself a system of remembrance, a way to revisit every event without speaking a word of it to the outside world. The shed above ground served as a perfect disguise for this hidden vault. On the surface, it looked neglected, a place where time had chewed away at everything inside. Rust covered the tools, dust coated the beams, and cobwebs clung to corners. Carl went to great lengths to maintain the illusion of abandonment, scattering broken furniture, letting old oil cans leak, and leaving paint cans to rot. When the police walked through, their flashlights swept across what they believed was the whole story. They didn't know that the rotting scene was staged for them, carefully arranged so that suspicion would fall away. Carl took quiet satisfaction in their visits. Each time officers stood inside the shed, unknowingly hovering over the trapdoor, he stayed calm. Their heavy boots echoed above his secret. Their questions floated in the stale air, but none of them thought to test the uneven planks beneath their feet. The ledger remained untouched below, its pages filling steadily as Carl continued to write, while the authorities left empty-handed. He relished the irony. The very place meant to expose him had become his strongest shield. The townspeople never guessed either. When whispers spread about the strange lights or the faint smell of smoke drifting from the property, they chalked it up to eccentricity. People had always thought Carl was odd, but odd didn't equal dangerous. His silence was mistaken for shyness, his distance for harmless solitude. No one imagined that just beneath the dust and decay lay a calculated record of lives taken and stored like inventory. The ledger grew over time, its pages thick with secrets. It was more than evidence, it was Carl's story told in his own hand, a secret memoir hidden beneath the shed, waiting in darkness. Every line he wrote was a confession, but one that only the earth itself seemed to hear. Above ground, life in the town carried on, people searching desperately for answers, while the truth sat quietly just a few feet below, bound in leather and ink. It was deep in the hunting season when the first real break in the case arrived, though no one realized it at the time. A hunter was moving quietly through the woods near Carl Harper's property, following the faint tracks of deer. The ground was wet with fallen leaves, soft and heavy after weeks of autumn rain. As he moved further into the brush, his boot struck against something buried. At first he thought it was a log or stone, but the faint outline of fabric caught his eye. Kneeling down, he pulled back the damp leaves and found a backpack pressed into the soil, half hidden as though someone had tried to cover it. Inside, water damaged but intact, were belongings that matched those of the missing teenager. A phone, a crumpled notebook, and a jacket that the boy's family had described in detail. The discovery reignited everything. Police swarmed the area within hours, marking trees with tape and combing the forest for any trace of more evidence. The backpack was undeniable proof that the missing teenager hadn't simply run away. Something had happened to him within steps of Carl Harper's land. The farmhouse, long whispered about in hushed tones, became the center of suspicion once again. This time, the officers were determined not to let it slip from their grasp. They returned to Carl's property, approaching the shed with sharper eyes and heavier intentions. Unlike their earlier visits, the air carried an intensity, as though everyone involved was ready to peel back layers they had ignored before. They opened drawers, turned over buckets, checked the rafters for hidden compartments. The floor was examined more closely, boards tapped and prodded. Dust rose into the sunlight, clinging to their uniforms, but the hidden trapdoor remained invisible. Carl had crafted it well, with planks cut from the same wood as the original floor, disguised by careful weathering. To the officers, it appeared as nothing more than part of the old structure's natural unevenness. Frustration grew with every passing hour. The shed looked ordinary, almost too ordinary. It had all the marks of age rot, rust, and clutter, but none of the concrete evidence they needed. The officers left with the same unease they had carried in, weighed down by the sense that something was wrong but unable to prove it. Carl stood by calmly, his expression unreadable, watching as they drove away again. He had rehearsed these moments in his mind for years, ensuring that the mask he showed to the world never cracked. In the weeks that followed, the town's fear deepened. The backpack was a sign, a reminder that the missing boy had been close all along. Parents tightened their grip on children, curfews were enforced, and whispers about Carl's property turned louder. Yet, without evidence, the law could only circle the same ground, unable to penetrate the secrets just below their feet. The farmhouse stood quiet as always, its sagging porch and dark windows offering no answers, while underground the truth waited, untouched and hidden, like a shadow the town could never quite catch. The secret began to unravel not through careful investigation, but by accident. After weeks of relentless rain, the ground surrounding Carl Harper's property grew soft and unstable. Water pooled in the low spots, seeping into the soil and pushing against anything buried beneath. Near the back of the shed, where the earth had long been disturbed by Carl's careful construction, the heavy rains forced a slow collapse. The ground sagged, splitting in places, until part of the shed floor gave way. Beneath the fractured boards, a dark opening yawned, the trapdoor now swollen and warped by water. For the first time, Carl's hidden chamber was no longer sealed from the world above when the police returned for yet another inspection, brought back by reports of flooding and damage. They finally noticed what had always escaped them. The uneven planks that once blended seamlessly into the rest of the shed now lifted at the corners, exposing the narrow outline of the entrance. An officer pried it open. the wood creaking under the strain, and the stale breath of the underground chamber rushed out like air from a sealed tomb. Flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing stairs that led downward into a place no one had ever known existed. The chamber below was far larger than anyone expected. The walls, reinforced with wood and metal, were lined with shelves holding items that froze the officers in place. Shoes, watches, wallets, and clothing were stacked neatly, each object belonging to someone the town had lost. The black notebook sat on a table, open to a page dated only weeks earlier. Its entries spelled out a chilling truth. Every disappearance had been calculated, every life catalogued in Carl's precise handwriting. The room was both workshop and archive, built to preserve the story of his crimes. The deeper the officers searched, the more the air grew heavy. Alongside the personal belongings were tools clean, sharpened, organized with a surgeon's precision. In a corner, containers held fragments of evidence too grim to mistake. The chamber was no longer just a hidden room, it was a graveyard of secrets. What the town had whispered about, what families had feared, was all here, silent and undeniable. News of the discovery spread quickly, shocking the community that had once dismissed their uneasy feelings about the farmhouse. People gathered at the edges of the property, staring at the shed with a mix of horror and disbelief. The same structure they had passed countless times. The same weathered building the police had walked through without suspicion had concealed everything beneath their feet. The realization struck like a cruel twist. The authorities had been inside the murder shed many times before, unaware that they stood directly above the truth. For Carl Harper, the Rains hadn't done years of careful planning. His greatest strength, the ability to remain unnoticed, collapsed under the weight of nature itself. The chamber that once offered safety now betrayed him, opening itself to the world. What had been hidden for so long was finally uncovered, exposing the dark story of the man who lived quietly at the end of Miller's Road, the man whose silence had allowed him to hide in plain sight.